The moment Emmett Lockhart rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a gray October morning in 1882, he was already 3 days past hungry and one bad decision away from sleeping in a ditch again, which was not so different from any other morning he had known in the last 4 years. He had not always been a drifter. There had been a time, before the war debts swallowed his father's land in Tennessee, and before the woman he thought he might marry chose a banker's son instead, when Emmett Lockhart had known what it felt like to wake up with four walls around him and a roof overhead. But that time had grown so distant it lived in him now only as a faint ache, the way an old break in the bone throbs before a storm. He had ridden west because there was nothing east worth riding back to, and for 4 years the open sky had been his ceiling, the hard ground his bed, and whatever work he could find his only honest compass. He was 27 years old and looked every year of it. His jaw was rough with a week's growth of dark beard, his canvas coat worn through at both elbows, and his horse, a sorrel mare named Patch for the white blaze that ran unevenly across her nose, was as tired and lean as her rider. Together they moved through Caldwell's main street at the slow, deliberate pace of two creatures who had learned not to waste what little they had left. Caldwell was a cattle town, one of the last real ones, sitting just above the Kansas Indian Territory line, where the Kishom Trail still brought longhorns up from Texas in the trailing end of the season. It smelled of dust and livestock and fresh-sawn lumber, which meant the town was still growing, still believing in itself. Emmett had passed through towns that had stopped believing. You could feel the difference the moment you rode in. He tied Patch to the rail outside the general store and went inside to spend the last 30 cents he owned on a tin of salt pork and a small sack of cornmeal. The woman behind the counter barely looked at him, which suited Emmett fine. He was not in the habit of making impressions. It was when he stepped back outside, tucking the paper-wrapped provisions into his saddlebag, that he first noticed the wagon. It sat across the street at a slight angle, as though the driver had pulled up in a hurry and not quite straightened it out. One of the rear wheels had sunk into a rut left soft by the previous night's rain, and the whole left side of the wagon had tilted down far enough that the crates stacked in its bed had shifted and now leaned dangerously toward the edge. A woman stood beside it, hands on her hips, examining the situation with the focused, unsentimental attention of someone who had already decided to fix the problem herself and was merely calculating the best way to do it. She was perhaps 24, with dark chestnut hair pinned back firmly beneath a wide-brimmed hat, a calico dress the color of faded blue sky, and the kind of posture that suggested she had never once in her life waited for someone else to solve her difficulties. Her face was striking rather than delicate, all clean angles and frank brown eyes, and there was a smear of axle grease on her left forearm that she either had not noticed or did not care about. Emmett watched for a moment. Several men passed the wagon without stopping. A boy on the boardwalk stared at it and kept walking. The woman crouched down, looked at the wheel, stood back up, and pushed her hat back slightly on her head, which was apparently her version of cursing under her breath. He crossed the street. "Wheels deep in that rut," he said. "You are going to need something to lever it out with. You got a plank anywhere in that bed." She looked at him with the swift, assessing gaze of a woman who had learned to judge strangers quickly and accurately. Whatever she saw must have been acceptable enough because she nodded toward the wagon bed. "There is a length of oak board under the tarp on the left side. I was just about to get it." "I will get it," he said, already moving. He found the board, worked it under the wheel at the correct angle, and with her pushing on the wagon's side rail and him working the lever, they rocked the wheel free of the mud in 3 attempts. She straightened, breathing a little hard, and pushed a loose strand of hair back from her face with her wrist. "Thank you," she said. She said it directly, without the excessive apology or performance that some people wrapped around gratitude. Just 2 plain words that meant exactly what they were. "Welcome," he said, and started to turn back toward Patch. "You looking for work?" He stopped, turned back slowly. "What kind of work?" "The honest kind," she said, and there was a flicker of dry humor in it. "I have a homestead 6 miles south of town. I lost my hired hand 3 weeks ago when he decided California was a better prospect than Kansas. I have got 40 acres of winter wheat that needs covering before the first hard freeze, a fence line on the north pasture that is not a fence so much as a suggestion at this point, and a hay supply that will not last my stock through January if I do not haul another 4 loads before the weather turns." She paused. "I pay fair wages, $4 a week, meals included." Emmett looked at her steadily. "You are out here hiring a stranger off the street." "You are not a stranger anymore," she said. "You just freed my wagon from a rut which is more than every other man who walked by managed to accomplish. I am Anna Barrett. I'm a practical woman, and practically speaking, I need help before winter, and you look like you need work before tonight." He almost smiled. Almost. "Emmett Lockhart." She extended her hand, which surprised him enough that for half a second he just looked at it. Then he shook it. Her grip was firm. "You got somewhere to be, Emmett Lockhart?" she asked. "No," he said honestly. "Then come help me load these last crates and we will ride out together." It was that simple and that sudden, the way most things in the West were when they mattered. He untied Patch and led her alongside the wagon, and Anna Barrett climbed up to the seat with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times, gathered the reins, and clicked her tongue at the team without ceremony. They rolled south out of Caldwell in the thin October sunshine, and for the first time in longer than Emmett could precisely calculate, he was riding somewhere instead of just riding. The Barrett homestead appeared after 6 miles of flat, wind-combed grassland, and it was exactly what a working ranch looked like when a single capable woman had been maintaining it alone for an indeterminate amount of time. The main house was a solid, square-framed structure with a covered porch running across the front, not large but well-built, the kind of house that had been put up with intention. Beside it stood a barn that was in better shape than the fence she had described, which he confirmed when they swung past the north pasture, and he could see for himself that 3 full sections of it had posts either leaning or missing entirely. "My husband built the barn," Anna said, following his gaze at the fence line. "He was better at buildings than fence mending. I have been better at the mending, but there are only so many hours." Emmett absorbed the word husband without comment or visible reaction, which was a skill he had developed over 4 years of being careful in other people's domestic territories. He waited. "He passed 2 years ago," she said matter-of-factly, though there was a layer beneath the matter-of-fact quality that he recognized as the particular tone of people who have had a long time to make peace with grief but have not quite finished. "Fever. It was fast." "I am sorry," he said. "So am I," she replied. "He was a good man." She said nothing more on the subject, and he did not press. They unloaded the wagon together, and she showed him the bunkhouse, which was a small structure behind the barn, single room, with a cot, a wood stove, a lantern, and a window that looked west. It was modest to the point of severity, but it had a roof and 4 walls, and when Emmett stood in the middle of it and breathed in the smell of pine boards and old smoke, something deep and long tightened in his chest, released about a 1/4 inch. He had slept under the stars for 4 years. She had offered him a roof without making it a question. He was not sure why that detail struck him so hard. It was just a bunkhouse. It was just a job, but she had not said would you like or if you want or only if you need it. She had simply shown him where the lantern was and told him supper was at 6, and the absence of the question sat in him like something warm. He unpacked his bedroll and his saddle, set his rifle against the wall, and sat on the edge of the cot for a long moment in the early afternoon light, listening to the wind move through the grass outside and the distant sound of Anna Barrett in the yard, moving with purpose, never still. He told himself it was just a job. He had told himself a lot of things over 4 years. Supper was salt pork and boiled potatoes and fresh cornbread, and she set a place for him at the kitchen table without comment, as though feeding a hired hand was no different from feeding herself, which he suspected it was not to her. The kitchen was warm from the cook stove, and there was a kerosene lamp on the table and a second one on the shelf above the dry sink, and the windows held the last purple residue of sunset in their glass. She ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had a lot of things to get done after the meal. He ate with the grateful, careful manner of someone who had not always been sure where the next meal was coming from. "Where did you come from?" she asked, not in the prying way, more the way people asked when they were simply curious and direct enough to say so. "Tennessee, originally. Drifted west about 4 years ago." He paused. "Worked cattle drives mostly, some freighting, whatever was hiring." "You have range experience then?" "Yes." "Good," she said. "I am running 23 head of cattle and 8 horses. The cattle are Longhorn Cross, decent stock. The horses are working horses, not show animals." She looked at him across the table. "I do not need someone to take orders. I need someone who knows what to look at and can make a decision when I am not there to make it." He appreciated that. 4 years of taking orders from trail bosses and freight masters, and whoever happened to hold the money had left him with a profound appreciation for being treated as a man with a functioning mind. "I can do that," he said. She nodded once, satisfied. "Good. We start on the fence tomorrow." It became, over the following days, something he found difficult to describe even in his own mind. It was work, plainly. Physical, consistent, demanding work in the cold October air. The kind that used every muscle and required constant problem-solving, and left him bone-tired at the end of each day. But it was also something else, something he had not experienced in 4 years of drifting, which was the particular satisfaction of working towards something that would still exist tomorrow. A repaired fence was a repaired fence. Wheat that was properly covered was wheat that would come up in spring. There was a continuity to it that felt, in some way he could not quite articulate, like being tethered to the ground instead of perpetually skimming above it. Anna worked alongside him most of each day. She was not the kind of rancher who gave orders from a porch and watched. She carried fence posts and strung wire and handled her own team without asking for help unless the task was genuinely a 2-person job, at which point she asked without embarrassment. She had opinions about everything and shared them as though she expected them to be taken seriously, which he found, the more time he spent in her company, to be entirely reasonable, since her opinions were almost invariably correct. He learned her patterns. She was up before first light every day, started the stove and fed the horses before the sun cleared the eastern horizon, and was in the field by 7 with a cup of strong coffee that she drank standing up while she assessed the day's work. She broke at noon for a quick meal she had usually prepared the previous evening, and she worked until the light failed. She read in the evenings, a small collection of books she kept on a shelf beside the fireplace, and she kept a journal that she wrote in after supper, and she did not invite him into the house in the evenings except for meals, which he understood was not unfriendliness but the natural maintenance of appropriate boundaries between a widow woman and her hired hand. He respected those boundaries completely. He spent his evenings in the bunkhouse, tending to his gear or reading a week-old newspaper he had picked up in Caldwell, or simply sitting in the doorway with the wood stove's heat at his back and the open dark of the Kansas night in front of him, listening to the coyotes and thinking about things he had not allowed himself to think about in a long time. What he thought about, more often than he thought was wise, was Anna Barrett. He noticed the way she laughed, which she did not do often, but when she did it was quick and real, a short, bright sound that seemed to surprise even her. He noticed the way she talked to her horses, not babying them but speaking to them directly, explaining what she was about to do before she did it, as though they deserved the courtesy of advance information. He noticed the way she looked at the land, not with the anxious, measuring gaze of someone worried about what it owed her, but with a kind of quiet love for it, as though it were a companion rather than a resource. He thought it probably took a very particular kind of person to stay on a piece of Kansas land through a husband's death and an absent hired hand, and whatever else 4 years of widowhood on the frontier entailed, and come out the other side of it still looking at the land like that. By the second week, he had the north fence rebuilt and half of the south line reinforced. The wheat was covered. He had also identified that the barn's east wall had a slow rot creeping up from the base that would become a serious problem by spring if it was not addressed, and he had started in on it without being asked, which Anna noticed when she came out one morning to find him with a crowbar and a stack of fresh lumber. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment, reading the situation, and then she said, "I was going to deal with that in spring." "Spring might be too late," he said. "The rot is in the sill plate. If it gets through a wet winter, it will take the whole bottom course with it." She crossed her arms and looked at the wall. "How long to fix it properly?" "2 days," he said. "Maybe 3. She uncrossed her arms. "All right," he looked at her. "You are not going to tell me to wait for your approval before I start work on something." She raised an eyebrow at him, which was a gesture he had already learned was her version of mild incredulity. "You saw a problem and started fixing it. Why would I reprimand you for that?" "My last employer would have," he said. "Your last employer sounds like he needed to feel more important than the fence," she said, and went back to her morning chores. He worked on the barn wall and thought that Anna Barrett was the most sensible human being he had encountered in 4 years of being in the company of a very wide variety of human beings. The first snow came in early November, earlier than usual, a thin, dry skiff that dusted the prairie like powdered sugar and melted by afternoon. But it was a warning, and they both knew it. There was still hay to haul, and Emmett made 2 trips into town with the wagon, and came back with loads that he stacked in the barn with the methodical care of a man who had seen winter kill livestock and intended to prevent it. It was on the second of those return trips, a gray Wednesday afternoon with the sky the color of old pewter, that he encountered trouble in the form of a man named Deke Hadley. Hadley was a stocky, red-faced man who ran a small operation 5 miles east of the Barrett place, and who had, Anna had mentioned once in passing and without apparent great concern, made her an offer on the property after her husband died. She had declined. Hadley had not entirely accepted this. Emmett was pulling the loaded wagon back through the edge of town when Hadley stepped out from in front of the feed store with 2 men behind him. "That Barrett's wagon," Hadley said. It was not a question. "It is," Emmett said. He kept the reins easy in his hands. "You working for the widow Barrett?" "I am." Hadley put one boot up on the wheel hub and leaned on his knee in the posture of a man who believed physical imposition was a form of argument. "You tell her from me that my offer still stands. $1,000 for that quarter section. It is a fair price considering." "Considering what?" Emmett asked evenly. "Considering a woman alone can't hold a homestead through a full winter." Hadley's smile was the kind that did not involve his eyes. "Tell her to think about it." Emmett looked at the boot on his wheel hub for a moment, then looked at Hadley's face. "I will pass the message along," he said. "Now take your foot off the wheel." Hadley held the position for just long enough to make a point of it, then stepped back. Emmett clicked the team forward without another word and did not look back. He told Anna over supper that evening with the same plainness she used for everything. She listened, set her fork down, and was quiet for a moment. "He has been sending messages like that for 2 years, she said. "He thinks persistence will eventually wear me down." "Will it?" She looked at him with those frank brown eyes. "I built this place with my husband, Emmett. I buried him in the north field beside the cottonwood tree. I have kept this land through 2 droughts and 1 hailstorm that took out half my wheat and a hired hand who walked off in September. No," she said, "it will not wear me down." He held her gaze for a moment and felt something shift in him with a weight and completeness that he recognized, even as he told himself not to recognize it, as the beginning of something that went a great deal beyond the professional. "All right," he said quietly. "Then we make sure everything is in order before winter closes in." She picked her fork back up. "That is exactly what we do." What followed was the most productive 3 weeks Emmett Lockhart had known in 4 years. They worked through November with the steady, almost domestic efficiency of 2 people who had discovered they operated on the same instincts, completing the hay hauling, reinforcing the barn, checking every inch of the fence lines, and laying in enough firewood that the two stacks behind the house and beside the bunkhouse were each 5 feet high and solid. Anna killed 2 of her older cattle before the hard freeze for winter meat, and Emmett helped her with the work without flinching, because winter in Kansas was not sentimental. They talked more as the weeks went on, gradually, the way people talk who have been working together long enough that silence is comfortable but words are easy too. She told him about her husband, Thomas Barrett, who had come from Ohio with a surveyor's careful eye and a carpenter's hands, and had broken the original sod on this quarter section in 1876. She told him about the homestead's early years, the grasshopper plague of 1874 that had hit the farmers around them a few years before they arrived, and the neighbors who had packed up and left, and the ones who had stayed. He told her more than he usually told anyone. About Tennessee and the land his father had lost, about the cattle drives he had worked in his early years out west, about a winter he had spent in a line shack in Wyoming working for a large outfit where the foreman was brutal and the conditions worse, and about the particular freedom and particular loneliness of sleeping every night under the open sky with nothing but your horse and a fire for company. "Did you never want to settle somewhere?" she asked one afternoon. They were stacking the last of the firewood, working in an easy rhythm, passing the split oak between them. "I told myself I was looking for the right place," he said, and mostly I was just moving," he admitted. "It is easier to keep moving than to stop somewhere and risk caring about it." She was quiet for a moment, setting a log precisely into the stack. "Caring about it meaning losing it," she said. "Yes, I understand that," she said. "When Thomas died I thought about leaving, selling to Hadley or whoever and going to stay with my sister in St. Louis, starting over somewhere where nothing reminded me of anything. Why didn't you?" She looked out across the brown winter grass of the pasture toward the cottonwood in the north field, its bare branches sharp against the sky. "Because the things that reminded me of him were not only sad, most of them were good. And I did not want to leave the good things just because they hurt sometimes." He did not reply because there was nothing to add that would not diminish it. They finished stacking the wood in the late afternoon light, and the cold came in from the north as the sun went down, and the land was very quiet and very wide. The first real snow came on the 22nd of November, and it came seriously. Not a skiff, but a full-scale November blizzard that rolled down out of the north on a Thursday evening and buried the world in 2 feet of white by Friday morning. Emmett had slept through worse winters in the open, but sleeping through it in the bunkhouse with the wood stove crackling and the walls solid around him was a different experience entirely. He was out at first light, or what passed for it through the white obliteration of the storm, breaking paths through the drifts to the barn and the cattle pen and the water trough. He was thigh-deep in one particularly obstinate drift when he heard the barn door open and saw Anna coming through the snow in her wool coat and heavy boots, 2 buckets in hand, already on her way to do exactly what he was already doing. "Go back inside," he called over the wind. "Stop telling me what to do," she called back, pleasantly, as though the wind were not trying to push her sideways. They fed the stock together in the cold, snow-blurred morning, moving between the animals with the practiced coordination they had developed over 6 weeks of shared work. And when they were done, they stood in the relative shelter of the barn's interior and caught their breath. Her cheeks were brilliant red from the cold, and there were snowflakes melting in her dark hair where her hat had not quite covered it, and she was looking at the cattle with that frank, assessing gaze she gave to every problem, checking ears and eyes for signs of cold stress. She was not looking at him at all, and he was looking at her with a focus and an intensity that he was glad she could not see. "Go get warm," she said without turning. "I will finish checking the horses. I can Emmett." She did look at him then, and there was something in her eyes that was gentle in a way her efficiency rarely allowed room for. "You have been up since before dawn. Go have coffee. I will be in directly." He went. He went because she asked him to, And because lately when she asked him things, he found himself considerably less resistant than he had been to anyone's requests in a very long time. He built the kitchen stove back up and made coffee and was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups ready when she came in, stomping snow from her boots on the porch. She came inside and stopped at the sight of the coffee, and something crossed her face that was quiet and warm and surprised. "You made coffee," she said. "It seemed indicated," he said. She sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around the cup, and they sat there together in the snow-muffled kitchen, while the blizzard worked at the windows and the stove ticked with heat. It was, Emmett thought, the most at home he had felt anywhere in 4 years, and the realization sat in him like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings outward in every direction. He did not say anything for a while. Neither did she. But the silence was of the specific, weighted variety that both of them could feel and neither of them addressed directly, because they were both, in their own ways, people who preferred to approach important things carefully. It was during the days following that first blizzard, when they were snowbound and working close together repairing equipment and mending tack in the warmth of the barn, that the texture of things between them began to change in a way that was slow and unmistakable, and Emmett felt somewhat terrifying. He was rolling a bridle when she asked him, out of nowhere, what he thought about. "When," he said, "when you were out there, drifting, what did you think about at night when you could not sleep?" He kept working the awl through the leather, thinking about the honest answer. "About whether it was always going to be like that," he said finally. "About whether there was something wrong with me that made it so I couldn't stay anywhere." She was braiding a new lead rope with quick, deft fingers. "Was there?" "I don't think so anymore," he said. She did not press for what had changed. But she looked at him for a moment with an expression that was considering and warm and careful. And then she returned to her braiding, and he returned to the bridle. And the barn was full of the smell of horses and leather and clean, cold air. And he thought that if he had to pick the moment, he started to be genuinely frightened. Not in the way of danger, but in the way of something that mattered enormously. It was that moment. December settled in with its full cold weight, the kind of Kansas winter that made even livestock look philosophical. The days were short and blue-white and sharp, and the evenings came fast and brought with them an increasing habit of fire and conversation in the house's front room that had begun without either of them deciding it should. It happened by gradual accretion. One evening he had stayed past supper to help her with the account books because she mentioned she was behind, and another evening because the temperature dropped so fast that going back to the bunkhouse felt genuinely impractical, and then a third and a fourth, and eventually it was simply what happened after supper, and neither of them questioned it. They talked about everything. She was sharply intelligent and widely read, and had opinions about politics and land rights, and the treatment of the Comanche and Cheyenne people who had been displaced from this same land they now farmed, and she held those opinions with a seriousness that did not allow for comfortable evasion. She was not sentimental about the West the way some people were, the way that involved ignoring who had been here before and what had happened to them. "My husband used to say that what we were doing out here was only possible because of what had been done to others," she said one evening. She was sitting in the wooden chair by the fire with a book closed in her lap, looking at the flames. "Did not pretend otherwise. I do not either. We are on land that belonged to people who were pushed off it by force. That is not a comfortable thing to think about while you are planting wheat." "No," Emmett agreed. He was sitting across from her, turned slightly toward the fire. "But I think it matters that you think about it at all. Does it change anything?" "Maybe not the past," he said slowly. "But I think people who are honest about how they came to have what they have treat what they have differently." More carefully, she looked at him. "Is that what you think I do?" "I think you treat this land like it deserves your best effort," he said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That is the nicest thing anyone has said to me in quite a long time." The fire popped. The wind moved around the corners of the house in its night voice. "Anna," he said, and then stopped himself, because the way her name came out of him in that particular tone was more than he had given himself permission to say. She looked at him steadily. He breathed in. "I don't want to make things complicated for you. I am aware of what my situation is here." "And what is your situation?" she asked. Her voice was level and direct, the way it always was. "Hired hand," he said, "and you have enough to manage without." "Emmett," she said, with a slight edge that was not irritation but precision, the tone she used when she was cutting through something. "I am 24 years old. I am not fragile. I do not need protecting from a difficult conversation." He held her gaze. "All right. Say what you were going to say." He took a breath. "I am not sure I know how to want something and not immediately be afraid of losing it. I have been moving for 4 years partly to avoid that problem." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire settled. Outside, the wind found a loose board somewhere and worked at it with a sound like a question. "I know something about that too," she said finally. "Losing Thomas was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and for a long time after it I thought the answer was to need less, want less, so it could not hurt as much." "And now?" he asked. She looked at the fire for a moment and then back at him. "And now I think that was wrong. I think the answer is probably to want things anyway." It was not a declaration. It was not a romantic speech. It was Anna Barrett being exactly who she was, practical and honest and brave in the specific way of people who have been hurt and have decided to keep going anyway. And it moved through Emmett Lockhart like the first warm day after a long winter, complete and unambiguous. He did not cross the room and kiss her that evening, because that was not who either of them were, and because there was a right way to do things and he intended to do it the right way. But when he finally walked back to the bunkhouse in the cold dark, he was aware that something had been decided, even if neither of them had yet said the deciding word out loud. Christmas came to the Barrett homestead quietly, the way Christmas came to most frontier places in 1882, without fanfare but with its own specific warmth. Anna made a mincemeat pie from dried apples and the last of the dried cranberries she had put up in autumn, and she roasted a chicken she had been fattening for the occasion, and she set the table with the good cloth she brought out only for particular days. Emmett had ridden into Caldwell 3 days before, and had spent a careful portion of his wages on a bolt of green wool fabric he had seen her look at twice in the general store, and a small illustrated almanac he thought she would read. He had not been sure about giving them to her, turning the question over and discarding it, and then deciding he was tired of being afraid of small things when he had made his peace with large ones. She opened the packages at the kitchen table on Christmas morning, and when she saw the green wool she was very still for a moment, and then she looked up at him with an expression that was wholly unguarded and that he would remember for the rest of his life. "You noticed," she said. "You looked at it twice," he said. She shook her head once, not in negation but in the way of someone absorbing something they did not expect. "Thank you, Emmett." She had gotten him a pair of good wool gloves, sturdy and thick, because she had watched him work through November with inadequate ones and had not said anything about it at the time. He put them on and they fit perfectly, and he thought that was a very Anna Barrett kind of gift, specific and useful, and given from attention rather than sentiment, and also, in its way, deeply sentimental. They ate Christmas dinner together, and it was the best meal Emmett had sat down to in 4 years and possibly longer. And afterward they sat by the fire and she read aloud to him from one of her books for a while, a novel she had been working through, and he sat and listened to her voice and the fire and the Christmas dark outside and felt, with a certainty that had been building for weeks, that he did not want to leave this place. He did not want to leave. That was the flat, simple truth of it. He had not wanted to be anywhere specific in 4 years, and he wanted to be here, on this piece of Kansas land with this woman, and the wanting was clear and large and no longer frightening in the way it had been at the beginning. It had become instead something solid, something he could stand on. He did not say all of this on Christmas Day. He sat with it a while longer. The way you sit with something important before you speak it into the open air, where it becomes real and unretractable. January brought new cold and new trouble in the form of Deke Hadley, who apparently had decided that, with the season turning and the winter well established, it was time to intensify his attentions to the Barrett property. He came to the homestead on a Tuesday morning in the second week of January, which was the first clear day after a week of successive snowstorms, riding up to the house on a big gray horse with two men behind him. Emmett was working on a frozen water line near the barn when he heard the horses and straightened up. Anna was already on the porch, which was where she went any time she heard riders approaching from a direction she had not expected. Hadley pulled up at the gate and made a production of looking around the property as though he were already assessing ownership. "Morning, Mrs. Barrett," he called. "Mr. Hadley," she replied. Her voice was perfectly even. "Rough winter," he said with the specific warmth of a man whose warmth costs him nothing. "I wanted to come by and see if you were managing all right." "We are managing well, thank you." His eyes moved to Emmett, who had stayed where he was, watching. Something calculated moved across Hadley's face. "I have increased my offer," he said, and the pleasantry dropped out of his voice like a stone into water. $1,200 for the quarter section. "That is a generous number, Mrs. Barrett, and I think you know it." "It is a generous number," Anna agreed. "And the answer is still no." Hadley's jaw tightened. "A woman alone on 40 acres in a Kansas winter. She is not alone," Emmett said. He walked from the water line to the gate fence slowly and stood there. He was not imposing or threatening. He was simply present, which was sometimes the most effective position. Hadley looked at him for a long moment. "You her hired hand." "I am," Emmett said. "Hired hands move on," Hadley said. It was a statement designed to be a threat. "Some do," Emmett said agreeably. "I have not yet found a reason to." The two men looked at each other across the fence in the cold January morning, and it was the kind of look that says a great deal without saying anything. Hadley pulled his horse around after a moment that was just long enough to feel like concession rather than retreat. "Think about it, Mrs. Barrett," he called over his shoulder. "I have finished thinking about it, Mr. Hadley," she called back. He rode away with his two men, and the sound of their horses faded into the white prairie quiet. Emmett stayed at the fence until they were gone, and then he turned and found Anna still on the porch, watching where they had gone, her arms crossed over her chest in the cold. "He will come back," she said. "Probably," Emmett agreed. "He thinks time will do what he cannot." She looked at Emmett with a steady, considering expression. "He does not understand that time is not on his side." Emmett came back to the gate, then up onto the porch steps and stood below her on the first step so they were nearly the same height, and he said, "Anna," and she looked at him. "I have been trying to figure out how to say something for about 6 weeks, he said. "I know," she said simply. "You know what I want to say?" "I think so." Her voice was quiet and direct, and there was something in her eyes that was open in a way he had not seen before. All the competence and composure still there, but something else underneath it. Something that was also, if he read it right, afraid in the same specific way he was afraid. Which was to say, not afraid of him, but afraid of wanting something. "I do not want to leave here," he said. "I do not want to leave you. I do not know if I have anything to offer you beyond what I already am, which is a man with a horse and some skills, and not a great deal else. But I know that I have not felt like I belonged anywhere since I was 22 years old, and I feel like I belong here, and I think that has everything to do with you." She was very still for a moment. The cold worked around them, and the snow lay white and bright in every direction, and the sky was a pure winter blue. "You belong here," she said, "if you want to." He stepped up onto the porch and he kissed her, carefully, and with the full weight of everything that had been building since October, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything in her life, and it tasted of wood smoke and cold air and something permanent. When they pulled back, she looked at him, and there was color in her face and her eyes were bright, and she said, "I have wanted to do that since the fence posts," and he laughed, a real laugh, the kind he had been using so rarely that it surprised them both with its openness. "Since the fence posts," he said. You reset those corner posts exactly level without a plumb line, she said. Just by eye. I watched you do it and I thought this is a man who cares about doing things right. She paused. I find that very attractive. The fence posts, he said again, still smiling. Do not make it strange, she said, and he heard the teasing in it, and it was so unexpectedly playful, so different from her usual brisk efficiency, that it delighted him. The weeks that followed had a new quality to them. Not the competent warmth of before, though that was still there, the daily work and the shared meals and the practical efficiency. This was warmer, and held more laughter, and held also the particular tenderness of two people who have decided to move toward each other rather than carefully in parallel. He kissed her in the barn doorway one evening, when she came to tell him supper was ready, and the setting sun was filling the western sky with orange and gold. He held her hand when they walked the fence line on a February afternoon that was almost warm. She brought coffee to the bunkhouse one morning when he was up early with a sick horse and stayed an hour, sitting on the cot's edge while he worked, talking quietly about nothing important, which was its own kind of everything. He asked her in March. Not extravagantly, because neither of them were extravagant people. They were coming back from the north field in the early evening, walking side by side through the greening spring grass, and the cottonwood tree was just beginning to think about leaving out, and she stopped to look at Thomas Barrett's grave for a moment the way she always did when she passed it, quiet and composed. He waited until she was finished, and then he said, I want to stay here, permanently, not as a hired hand. She looked at him. I am asking you to marry me, he said, if you will. She looked at him for a long moment in the soft March evening, and then she took his hand, which she had been doing for about 2 months, but it still made his chest do something complicated. Yes, she said, just yes, clean and sure, no performance, no ceremony of hesitation, just Anna Barrett saying yes the way she did everything, completely and without qualification. They were married in Caldwell on the last Saturday of April 1883. The reverend who performed the ceremony was a practical man from the Methodist Church who married couples quickly and without excessive embellishment, which suited them both. Mrs. Clara Holt from the neighboring homestead 3 miles north came and stood as witness, a small woman with keen eyes who had been Anna's closest friend since their early years on adjacent claims. The storekeeper and his wife were there, and 2 of the ranch hands from the outfit east of town, who had come to know Emmett over his winter of supply runs into town. Anna wore the green wool dress she had made from the fabric he had given her at Christmas. He wore a clean white shirt and the good coat he had bought with his first full month's wages in October. They stood together in front of the reverend in the small church, and when the reverend said the words and Emmett repeated them, he meant each one with a completeness that was different from anything he had said in his life. When the reverend said he could kiss his bride, Anna turned to him, and there was that color in her face again, and her eyes were bright and open, and he kissed her in front of all 4 witnesses, and Mrs. Holt made a sound of pleased approval. They had a small supper at the hotel's dining room afterward, all 6 of them, and it was full of laughter and stories and the particular warmth of a celebration that is small enough for everyone in it to mean something to everyone else. On the ride back to the homestead in the spring evening, Anna sat beside him on the wagon seat and leaned against his arm, and they were quiet for a long stretch of it, the prairie all around them in the last light, the grass that was coming back green and the sky going deep blue overhead. For years, he said, thinking aloud. She looked at him. I slept outside for 4 years, he said. I used to lie there and think there was something wrong with me, that I could not hold on to a place, that it was my nature to drift. She was quiet for a moment. And now I think I was just looking for the right place and the right person, he said. And when I found them in the same location, I nearly talked myself out of it anyway. She looked at him with those brown eyes that he had come to know so thoroughly that he could read their every shade. But you did not, she said. No, he agreed. I did not. She took his arm in both of hers and leaned her head against his shoulder for the rest of the ride home, and the stars were coming out above them one by one in the spring dark, and they were the same stars he had been sleeping under for 4 years, but they looked different now. Not because they had changed, because he had somewhere to wake up to in the morning. Spring on the Barrett homestead, which he supposed he should start thinking of as the Lockhart homestead, or perhaps simply as home, came in with the particular extravagance of a Kansas spring following a hard winter. The wheat came up strong and even, covering the fields in a green so vivid it seemed painted. The cattle put on weight quickly on the new grass, and the horses were lively in the warming air and needed exercising every day, which Emmett did in the early mornings, working each horse through its paces in the east pasture while the sun came up behind him. Deke Hadley made one more appearance at the property in May, and this time he rode up to find Emmett and Anna both in the yard, working together on a new chicken coop they were building from fresh-sawn lumber. Hadley looked at them together, looked at the work in progress, looked at the general condition of the property, which was considerably better than it had been in October, and his jaw did the thing it did when he was calculating. "I see things have changed," he said flatly. "They have," Anna said pleasantly. "Is there something we can help you with?" He looked at Emmett. "You bought the place." "He married me," Anna said before Emmett could answer. "Which I suspect is equally discouraging news for your purposes." Hadley sat on his horse for a moment longer, and then he turned it around and rode back the way he had come, and that was the last they saw of him professionally. He passed them in town twice over the following months, and nodded with the slightly constipated courtesy of a man who has accepted a loss he finds undignified, and that was all the trouble he ever gave them again. Summer came in hot and golden and full of work, the way summer on a working ranch always is. They put up a new section of fence on the west line, extending the pasture, and added a small kitchen garden behind the house that Anna had been intending to establish for 2 years, but had not had enough hands for. They worked it together in the evenings, which was a kind of contentment so specific and domestic that it sometimes struck Emmett with a physical quality, like walking into a warm room from the cold. He found that being married to Anna Barrett, which was to say Anna Lockhart now though she kept Barrett as well, using both as the occasion demanded, was in many ways continuous with having known and worked with her for months. She was still the most practical person he had ever encountered, still direct and efficient and intellectually honest and deeply funny in the dry, precise way that only surfaced when she felt comfortable. What was different was the access, the closeness, the way she turned to him in the night sometimes, and he could feel the complete specific fact of her beside him, warm and real and his. The way she reached for his hand sometimes without looking, just knowing he was there. The way she included him in her thoughts about the future of the property, with the natural ease of someone who had stopped thinking of it as hers alone. She talked about expanding the cattle herd before summer's end, and he thought it was viable and said so, and they worked out the numbers together at the kitchen table on a June evening with the windows open and the smell of the grass coming in on the warm air. They bought 7 additional head in July, good young stock from a reputable outfit 2 counties east, and the herd grew to 30, and the north pasture with its newly reinforced fence held them comfortably. Clara Holt came by regularly through the summer months, and she and Anna would sit on the porch and talk in the way of women who have known each other long enough to dispense with every form of performance, frank and quick, and occasionally hilarious. Clara was 40 and had the energetic pragmatism of a woman who had homesteaded alone for 8 years after her husband left, not by death, but by the considerably less romantic method of deciding homesteading was too hard and heading back east without her, which Anna and Clara discussed with a shared, entirely undramatic matter-of-factness that Emmett found rather admirable. It was Clara who, at the end of July, looked at Anna during one of these porch visits with a particular, assessing, experienced eye and said, "How are you feeling?" Anna set her lemonade glass down and looked at Clara with an expression that was both composed and slightly unsteady. "Tired," she said, more than usual. Clara looked at her another moment. "Has it been 6 weeks?" Anna said quietly. They looked at each other with the complete, information-dense communication of two women who have been friends long enough that half a conversation is unnecessary. Emmett was in the barn and had not heard any of this. But when he came in for supper that evening and found Anna standing at the kitchen window with her back to him, not cooking yet, just standing, he stopped. "Anna," she turned. She was trying to keep her face arranged in its usual composed lines and not quite succeeding. There was something soft and enormous just behind her eyes. He crossed the kitchen and put his hands on her face, and she let him, and her eyes filled. "I think we are going to have a child," she said. He stood there for a moment with his hands cupping her face, looking at her, and the thing that moved through him was not surprise so much as a vast, complete rightness. He pulled her in close and held her, and she let him hold her with her face against his chest, and they stood like that in the kitchen while the summer evening settled around the house. "All right," he said very quietly against her hair. She made a sound that was partly a laugh. "That is all you have to say, all right." "It is the best thing I know how to say right now," he told her. "Everything bigger than all right is still trying to find words." She laughed properly then, and the tension in her shoulders released, and she pulled back and looked at him with wet eyes and a real smile, and he kissed her forehead and her cheeks and then her mouth, and she tasted of lemonade and tears, and it was the best thing he had ever tasted. The news settled over the summer like sunlight settling over the fields, slowly and warmly, and changing the quality of everything it touched. Anna's energy ebbed somewhat in the early weeks, which she found intolerable, and he found absolutely understandable and said so, which did not entirely placate her but helped. He quietly took on additional morning tasks without mentioning it, and she noticed, and did not say anything because she knew he knew she noticed, and they both understood this was the kind of thing that did not require acknowledgement to be appreciated. He repaired the porch railing in August, adding a second rail she had not asked for but which he noticed was needed, working in the late evening after supper while the fireflies started up in the grass, and the temperature finally moderated from the July ferocity. She came out with a cup of coffee for him and leaned against the porch post and watched him work in the lantern light, and said, "You are going to run out of things to fix eventually." "I doubt it," he said. "There is always something." She looked at him in the lantern light with the kind of look that she gave him sometimes that was simply, unambiguously full of love, not the dramatic kind, the full kind, the kind that had taken up residence in the everyday fabric of their lives and was now simply present in it, the way the wood smoke was present and the grass smell and the sound of the stock in the pasture at evening. He looked back at her with the same thing in his eyes, and neither of them said anything, and the fireflies continued their patient business in the dark. Autumn came again, the 1-year return of the season that had brought Emmett to Caldwell on a tired horse with 30 cents, and it came with an emotional resonance that surprised him with its force. He rode into town one October morning to pick up provisions, and he passed the spot where Anna's wagon had been stuck in the rut on this same street, and he sat there for a moment on patch, looking at it. Just an ordinary patch of Main Street, slightly rutted still from years of wagon traffic. Just a spot where a wheel had sunk into mud, and a woman had been calculating how to free it herself, without asking for help. Everything had come from that moment, from his decision to cross the street instead of riding on, from her decision to offer him a job instead of just thanking him and letting him go. From two people who had each, for different reasons, become practiced in the management of solitude and the suppression of wanting things, recognizing in each other the specific, careful courage of someone who has decided to stop suppressing. He rode back to the homestead with the provisions and found Anna in the kitchen garden, moving more slowly than she had been in summer but still moving, still with her hands in the work, and she looked up when she heard him and waved, and he lifted a hand in return, and Patch settled into the familiar rhythm of the home lane that she knew by heart now, and everything about it was ordinary and complete. They spent their first anniversary quietly, just the two of them, With a good supper and the bottle of wine that Emmett had been saving from a purchase he had made in Caldwell in September, and they sat by the fire afterward, and he held her hand, and they talked about the year past and the year ahead, and she was beginning to show by then. A curve that was still modest but undeniable. And he found that he looked at it with a specific kind of feeling that had no useful word, but that was composed of tenderness and gratitude and a deep, sure wonder. "Do you ever think about what you would have done," she asked that evening, "if I had not been stuck in that rut?" "I think I would have ridden through Caldwell and kept going," he said honestly. "I had no reason to stop." "Where would you have gone?" He thought about it. "Nowhere in particular, that was rather the point." He looked at the fire. "I think I would have kept drifting, through winter and spring and into another summer and kept on until something stopped me or I stopped myself." She was quiet for a moment. "And the wheel in the rut was enough." "You were enough," he corrected gently. "The wheel in the rut just gave me a reason to talk to you." She turned to look at him, firelight moving on her face. "I think about it sometimes," she said, "how close it was to not happening. How many times that morning I almost sent Thomas's old hired hand Bert into town for those supplies instead of going myself. If I had done that, you would have ridden through and kept riding, and I would never have known the difference." "I would have known," he said, "eventually. Not what I missed, but that I had missed something. I would have felt it." She shook her head slightly, the way she did when she was moved and did not want to be moved in an obvious way. "You are going to make me cry," she said. "And I have been crying at entirely unreasonable things for 2 months, so please do not encourage it." He laughed and pulled her into his side, and she settled against him with her head on his shoulder, and the fire settled low around them, and the first year of their marriage rested behind them like good ground. The baby came in February. He came in the pre-dawn hours of a cold morning, with Clara Holt at Anna's side and Emmett wearing a path in the floorboards of the front room. And when Clara opened the bedroom door and said it was a boy and they were both well, Emmett sat down in the nearest chair with a force that was not quite intentional. He was allowed in a few minutes later, and Anna was pale and exhausted and more beautiful than anything he had ever seen, and the baby in her arms was red-faced and emphatically present in the way of new people who have not yet learned to be quiet about existing. "Hello," Anna said, looking at Emmett with the specific exhausted radiance of a woman who has just accomplished something extraordinary. "Come meet your son." He sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at the baby, who had stopped crying for the moment and was examining the middle distance with the concentrated, slightly accusatory focus of newborns. "He looks like he has opinions," Emmett said. Anna laughed weakly. "He absolutely does." They named him Thomas James Lockhart, Thomas for Anna's first husband, because he had been a good man and the land was partly his and that deserved honoring. James for Emmett's father, who had lost his land but had taught Emmett everything he knew about working it honestly. Thomas James Lockhart arrived in the world in February 1884 and proceeded to make himself known to it with considerable energy. The years that came after built on each other the way well-laid fence posts build a line, each one solid and true and supporting the next. Emmett's skills grew to encompass every aspect of the homestead operation, and he had an instinct for cattle that developed over the years into genuine expertise. They expanded the herd steadily, added a second hired hand in 1885 when the work outgrew 2 people's capacity, a quiet young man named Saul who came from Missouri and turned out to be talented with horses beyond ordinary expectation. Little Tom grew from a red-faced opinion holder into a small boy with his mother's frank brown eyes and his father's dark hair, who could tell a healthy animal from an ailing one at 4 years old, and who asked questions about everything with a persistence that was endearing and occasionally exhausting. He was followed, 3 years later, by a daughter they named Me Clara, the second name for her honorary Aunt Clara Holt, who accepted the honor with the brisk, pleased manner of a woman who has learned to receive things gracefully even when she is genuinely moved. Clara Holt herself married in 1886, which was a development that surprised her more than anyone else, to a widower farmer named George Paulson, who had the good fortune to appreciate her intelligence and the better fortune to make her laugh. Their wedding was held on the Paulson farm, and the Lockharts attended, all four of them, Tom in a clean shirt that he had already managed to get grass-stained by the time the ceremony started, and me in a white dress Anna had made, and Emmett standing beside his wife in the late afternoon sunlight with his hand in hers, and Clara Holt standing up at the front of the assembled company looking both entirely herself and entirely happy. In the fall of 1887, 5 years after Emmett had first ridden into Caldwell on a tired horse with 30 cents and no particular destination, the Lockhart homestead encompassed 60 acres, a herd of 48 cattle, a sound barn and bunkhouse, a repaired and expanded house with a second bedroom and a proper pantry, and a kitchen garden that produced enough surplus in summer that Anna sold vegetables at the Caldwell market on alternate Saturdays, which she did with the same directness and commercial intelligence she brought to everything else. Emmett had become, without intending the transition and without being able to identify exactly when it had occurred, a settled man. He had opinions about the winter wheat and the price of cattle and the reliability of the railroad and the politics of water rights in western Kansas. He knew his neighbors' names and their names knew his. He had a son who came to find him in the evenings when supper was ready, because it was one of the small daily privileges Tom had assigned himself, and he had a daughter who at 2 years old had already developed an opinion about horses that approximately matched her mother's, which was to say strong and specific and expressed without apology. And he had Anna. He had Anna in the mornings over coffee when the light came in from the east and the day was still theoretical. He had Anna in the evenings by the fire when the children were asleep and the house was quiet. He had Anna beside him in the cold and in the heat, and in every ordinary, specific, irreplaceable moment of the life they had built together on this piece of Kansas ground, and none of it had grown smaller or more routine with time. It had grown larger, more solid, more full of the particular richness that comes not from drama but from depth. He was riding the fence line on a late October afternoon in that 5th year when he stopped Patch at the northwest corner of the property and looked out over the full sweep of it, the brown autumn grass and the winter wheat just beginning to show green in the south field, and the smoke from the house chimney going up straight and pale in the still air. The cottonwood in the north field had gone full gold, the way it did every October, and it stood bright against the November pale sky like something deliberately placed. He sat there on Patch for a long time, the old mare standing quietly beneath him with the patience of age, both of them still and easy in the way of two creatures who have been in comfortable company long enough that stillness needs no explanation. 4 years sleeping under the stars. One October morning with 30 cents and a mud-stuck wagon wheel. A woman who offered him a roof without making it a question, who did it the way she did everything, practically, directly, without excessive preamble, as though the right thing to do was obvious once you had properly assessed the situation. He thought she had been right about most things from the start. He thought she was right about this piece of land, that it deserved careful stewardship and honest labor. He thought she was right about Thomas Barrett, that a man could be honored in his death by the quality of what was built after it. He thought she had been right, on that cold November evening by the fire in their first year together, when she said she thought the answer to loss was probably to want things anyway. He clicked his tongue at Patch and turned her toward the house. The sun was going west toward Colorado, and the evening star was already up, and the smoke from the chimney was steady and straight, and meant supper was on. And somewhere in the house Tom was probably asking something that required a long answer, and me was probably investigating something she had been told not to investigate. He came into the yard and unsaddled Patch and turned her out and walked to the house, and when he pushed open the door the warmth came out at him, and with it the smell of cornbread and roasting meat, and the very specific warm noise of a full house at supper time, Tom's voice asking something emphatic and Anna's voice answering with the patient, decisive warmth she brought to all of it. She looked up when he came in. She was at the stove with a long-handled spoon and a child on her hip, specifically me, who was engaged in her second favorite activity, which was touching everything within her reach. And she looked at Emmett the way she always looked at him when he came in at the end of the day, which was to say with the particular, full, steady warmth of someone whose contentment is not a performance but a condition. "You are late," she said, without accusation. "I stopped at the northwest corner to look at the place," he said. She studied his face for a moment, reading it the way she had learned to read it over 5 years of close attention. And he hung his coat and hat on the peg beside the door and crossed the kitchen to her and bent and kissed her temple, which made me reach immediately for his beard with the cheerful acquisitiveness of a 2-year-old. "And it is a good place," he said. "It is a very good place." Anna looked at him for a moment longer, and then she smiled, which was still the same quick, real, bright thing it had been on that first afternoon when he had said something that surprised her, and it still affected him the same way it always had, which was to say entirely. "Yes," she said simply, "it is." Tom came in from the front room then, already talking, explaining something about a bird he had seen that day that he needed to describe completely and immediately. And me grabbed Emmett's beard with firm 2-year-old conviction, and he laughed and lifted her up. And Anna turned back to the stove with the spoon, and the kitchen was warm and full of voices, and the evening was coming down outside the windows, and the stars were coming up one by one over the Kansas prairie. The same stars that had been his roof for 4 years, still there above him, still large and familiar and clear. Only now, when the night came, he had somewhere warm to wake up to. He had a son who asked impossible questions and a daughter who had opinions about horses, and a woman who had looked at a stranger stuck beside a wagon wheel and seen, with the frank and practical clarity that was entirely her own, a person worth offering a roof to. He had ground beneath him. He had walls around him. He had the specific, daily, irreplaceable richness of a life that had been chosen rather than fallen into, built rather than inherited, wanted rather than merely tolerated. He sat down at the table, and Tom immediately turned the bird story to him, and me settled on his knee and reached for the breadbasket with complete confidence in her right to it. And Anna brought the pot to the table and they ate supper together in the lamplight, as the October night settled fully over the homestead, and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and the grass moved in the evening wind as it had always moved, as it would go on moving, over this piece of ground that had been many things to many people and was now, finally, home. Outside, the stars came out in their thousands over Kansas, burning clear and cold and beautiful in the October dark, the way they always had and would. But Emmett Lockhart did not sleep under them anymore. He had a roof, and the woman who had given it to him without making it a question was sitting across the table from him in the lamplight, saying something to Tom about the bird that made the boy laugh, and the lamp cast its warm circle over all of them, and everything was whole, and everything was well, and everything was, at last and without reservation, enough.